Good evening all, and welcome. Being September, many people are going to be starting, going back, or may have already returned to college. I do hope that you have a fantastic year ahead of you. However, if you are like some of these people, there could be horrors awaiting in your future. Let's hope it's not the case. But for now, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. In 1998, I worked as a security guard at a local Christian college. The first night on the job, I was told it was my responsibility to patrol the campus all night, to make sure the main doors were locked, and to ensure that all the lights were off in the chapel, and it was to be locked by 11 p.m. Standard stuff. So, I start out by walking around campus, getting to know a few students and just feel everything out. When 11 p.m. came, I went to the chapel and went to the basement first. Getting to the bottom stairwell door, I realize it won't open. I push on it 4 or 5 times, but the door seems locked. All lights are out, and it's secure. I go over to that stairwell door, and it opens easily for me from the outside. I figured it was just how the door was made. I go back upstairs and go to the stage where the light switches are at. I look up and I see what looks like a kid in the balcony. I yell for him to come down, but he doesn't answer. I climb the stairs to the balcony, but oddly enough when I get up there, I can't find him. I get creeped out, but I figure it's late and I'm just seeing shadows. I go back down, cut all the lights and lock up the chapel. At 3 a.m, I go out for the full campus rounds just to check up on everything. Heading across the quad, I notice that the lights are on in the basement of the chapel, as well as the front spotlight. I go to the basement back door and find it still locked. I go in, cut the lights, and as soon as I do, I hear a long, loud bang in the stairwell. I run in there and up the stairs thinking I'm chasing someone, but there's no one anywhere. I go back down and leave the back door and lock it. As I walk around, I notice the spotlight is off. I check to see if it could be motion controlled, but quickly figure out that it was not. Since it was my first night, I decided not to say anything. The second night changed that. I again had weird experiences around the chapel, but on night 2, I also hear weird crying sounds in the woods on the north side of campus. I ran my flashlight through the trees, but saw nothing. Later that night, I see 2 strange hooded teens down on the southwest side, near where the tennis courts are. I tried to get close to them, but it always seemed like they were constantly 20 to 30 yards away from me. No matter how fast I moved, I could never catch up. As I keep following them towards the edge of the campus, I hear a student yelling behind me, and I jerk my head towards the sound. When I turn back to look for the hooded figures, they are nowhere in sight. Out of breath, I walk back to the quad and sat down on a bench to collect my thoughts. I lie to myself and decide that everything is normal, and I'm just not used to staying up so late. All my rounds go okay for the next few hours, but at my 3 a.m. walkthrough, I see the lights in the chapel are on again. I check the doors and windows, but they are all securely locked. I unlock the main door and walk through the foyer and hear what sounds like shuffling coming from the stage. I look and don't see anything at first, so I go behind the curtain to make sure no one is backstage. After ensuring it was all clear, I flip all the lights off, and in that split second before everything went dark, I suddenly see a group of dark figures in a circle appear on stage. Then, total darkness. I flip the lights right back on, but once again, no one's there. I just flipped the lights off again, this time without looking, locked the door, and returned to the quad. Thankfully, the rest of the night was quiet. The next shift I worked, I decided to call and ask the guy who hired me and owned the security company about the weirdness. He said that one of the other guards would drop by and basically debrief me. The guard who showed up was a 300 pounds of pure muscle Cherokee beast of a man. I told him everything and he said, "Yep, that sounds about right." He then proceeded to tell me that everyone who worked there overnight had some experience. He said that the stairway doors actually do not lock, but he himself had spent 40 minutes one night locked between floors. He told me that he had thrown all his weight against both doors, but they would not move, and that every time he tried, he would hear this crazy laughter. He said he had chased what he thought were teens through the downstairs hall, just to watch them disappear. That another guard had walked into the chapel and stumbled into what looked like a sacrifice, with occult symbols drawn on the stage, and had chased off people with cloaks, only to find all evidence had disappeared when he came back after trying to catch the cloaked figures. He also said that occult symbols were constantly being found on campus, and that it was my job to gather and dispose of them. I nodded in shock, but felt relieved that I wasn't losing my mind. I continued to have weird experiences on that campus, even though nothing violent ever really happened to me. The atmosphere began to take on an undertone of malevolence. I started to dread every shift. Needless to say, I didn't stay there long. I attended a year at a very small, not well-known school. I lived in the dorms for a semester. In the dorms, the doors only locked from the inside, and the hallway lights were on a motion sensor after 10 p.m. to save power. My roommate and I were in our room, with the doors locked, and I was sitting at my desk writing a paper last minute, with only my laptop screen for light, because my roommate was trying to sleep. I was proofreading my paper at around 2:15 a.m. and closed my eyes for what I perceived as a second, to give them a rest, and when I opened them up, my computer screensaver had blacked out, as it was set for 15 minutes. In the dark, I heard my roommate thrashing in his bed and gasping into his pillow. It sounded like he needed air, so I said out loud, "Hey Mark, you okay?" And as soon as I said it, I heard him gasp like he had just come up for air from a swimming pool. As I said this, I bumped my mouse and the screen came on. The next two events happened so fast that for the longest time I wasn't sure of the order of things. Our door slammed open, even though it had been locked, and I heard footsteps run down the hallway to the right. These things happened almost immediately after I spoke and the screen came on. I opened the door to see who it was, and though I had still heard footsteps in the hall lights were off. Nothing had tripped the motion sensors, and only came on as I stuck my head out of the door, and the guy across the hall asked who had slammed the door and was running, and I had no answer for them. When I turned back into the room, Mark asked me why I thought it would be funny to hold his pillow over his face and try and suffocate him. Again, I had no answer. I explained things as I remember them to Mark, and he got the chills. We both asked to be transferred to another dorm room. The side of the family that raised me is very superstitious, but I generally am not. They have a history of seeing spirits and other unusual things. However, I have never seen anything blatantly paranormal. I went to a quaint little private college. A lot of the dorm buildings are super old and were converted from a convent, a hospital, and a funeral home. Well, I have a few stories. During sophomore year, I lived in the second largest room of the building that used to house a funeral home. I had 2 roommates, and the room was huge. Everything was normal for the first few months. Then, my significant other and I broke up, and I walked in on him and my roomie a few days later. I freaked out, and they started to avoid my room as they had started their own relationship. I would wander off to the local graveyard just because it was quiet, and I didn't have to deal with people. I crashed there a few times, but it was getting colder, so I was usually home by about 3 a.m. By then, my roomies would be asleep. Well, I would come into the room, walk across the pitch darkness, and without fail the light on my desk by the entrance would come on. This was every night that I came back from the graveyard. My roomies would be asleep. I'd be across the room changing, and the desk light would turn on. This stopped when I stuck a bunch of religious memorabilia around the lamp and stopped hanging out at the graveyard. Well, 2 years later, I'm in my senior year, and I've opted to live in this dorm building again. I've got my own room on the top floor. All is well for the first half of the year. Then I come home from winter break, and things get weird. I had pictures and my paintings all over the wall. They are all pretty secure. Well, every day at least one picture falls down, usually loud in the case of paintings, and it would wake me up from my sleep. I eventually stopped putting them back up. Then one night, I awake to glass shattering in my room. I don't own glass things, with the exception of shot glasses that I was using for a design assignment. They sat atop of my closet. I flipped on the lights to do an inspection of the room, and nothing is out of place, nothing is broken, and the glasses are still where I had left them. In the morning I check again. The glasses are where they are, and I go to class and return in the middle of the day, unlock my door, and the glasses are now sitting in the center of the floor. I get scared. I start to call my significant other before bed every night. On nights that he visits, the paintings don't fall, and I sleep better. I go to bed alone one night, put my laptop underneath my bed, face up and closed. It's the first decent laptop I've ever had, and I'm very protective of it. Again, I wake up to a large smash in the night. I flip on the light switch, and my laptop is upside down on the middle of the floor. A chunk of plastic from inside it is across the room. My laptop no longer works at all. Well, the next day, I flip. I scream all over whatever the hell is breaking my stuff and threaten to have a priest, rabbi, or whatever I can think of come in and expel it. I put paper and pencil on my dresser and make it very clear that if this thing tries to communicate with me through any means that is not directly writing on that piece of paper with that pencil, I will do everything in my power to have it removed. I line the walls and windows and doorways with salt and cover the room in religious stuff. I put my dream catchers up, and everything weird stopped happening. Last year, some months after graduating, I stumbled onto a page listing the hauntings of my college. I wasn't super social outside of my clique, and hadn't known that our school had such a history of hauntings, and that there was an annual lecture by the president about it. Apparently the ex-funeral home was said to be haunted by a little girl who passed away in a fire there. Whoops. One of the RAs mentioned to me that they would wake up to a little girl's voice asking where her bicycle was. So I guess they dealt with the little biddy too. My good friend and I hadn't seen each other in a few weeks, so we decided to go out to the arcade bar downstairs to hang out and catch up. She picks me up, we get to the bar and order our drinks, and then station up at Tetris. Now, a little bit of additional context, because in hindsight, I feel like it could have been a bit important to consider. We are both female, in our 20s, and aren't exactly the most subtle or modest when we're together. We aren't rowdy or chaotic, but we joke about a lot, laugh loudly, and are usually desperate to impress. We were having a good time dancing along to the music as we played games, and just really sort of stood out a bit from the more casual atmosphere of most patrons. We had arrived around 9:30 to 10 and ended up staying until about 12:40 AM. The arcade bar closes at 1 AM, so we finished our drinks, played one last game, and then decided to drive to another bar for the remaining 2 hours before everything closed at 3 AM. Driving under the influence is very dumb, I know. We had only a couple of light drinks though, and we weren't planning to go crazy. We live in a good-sized college town, but due to the weather being a little rainy and cold, there weren't a ton of people out and about on the streets as we walked back to her car, which was on the opposite end of the block, but still on the same stretch of road as the bar. Once we get in, we sit in the car for a few minutes, talking about various things. She was trying to pull up music on her phone, but the app was having connectivity issues, so it was taking much longer than it should have. In that time, a large white van pulls up and parks directly beside us. I remember pointing out when it parked next to us because it was huge. She drives a 2018 Jeep Wrangler, and this van's windows were on par or taller than our windows. It was pretty much the stereotypical creeper van, but I remember thinking it looked really nice, new, and shiny. At that point though, nothing was out of the ordinary, and we continued on talking and fiddling with the radio for another 5 or so minutes. Eventually, we give up on the music and start backing out of the parking space to head to the other bar. Coincidentally, the van starts up as well and backs out of their parking space just as we drive off. We never saw anyone get out of the van, so it seemed strange that they were suddenly now just leaving after having just parked next to us 10 or so minutes ago. Now, being two young women at the bar scene in a college town, we are always on the lookout. We are immediately suspicious of this van when we notice it behind us, but we write it off initially as a coincidence. To explain the setup a bit, our downtown is designed with essentially all north to south streets being alternating one-ways, with a few exceptions, and nearly all east to west streets being two-ways. Sometimes to get to a certain place, you're basically forced to take certain routes because of the one-ways. To get to the next bar, we turned left onto a one-way south, and then left again to go east on a two-way. At the very end of that street, about 5 blocks, was our destination. The van followed us the entire way at this point, and we were certain that it was not just a coincidence. We're trying to be hopeful that maybe they're just going to a bar as well, but my friend later recalled they never used any turn signals while behind us, and made sure to keep a close distance. There is a small parking lot behind the bar, and because of the one-way street next to it, there is literally only one route you can take to get to it. So we turned right onto the street, drive about 40 feet, and then immediately turn into the parking lot. Because of the bar itself, the parking lot isn't visible from the two-way street that we initially turned off, meaning the van wouldn't have been able to see us go into the parking lot until after they cleared the intersection. The parking lot is also a sort of C shape, with one strict entrance and one strict exit. So if you miss the entrance, you technically would have to drive all the way around the block again. Thankfully, there was another car at that intersection that got between us, so we had more time to hide in the parking lot and see if the van would also come around the corner. My friend immediately turned the Jeep's lights off. Funnily enough, we actually parked right next to another Jeep Wrangler, and we watched. Sure enough, within a few seconds the van made its appearance, but did not turn into the parking lot, and instead drove past it. However, this is why knowing about the one-ways is important. Because of the way the streets are set up, there would have only been two logical reasons why they would have turned after us on that one-way street. A. They were indeed going to a bar as well, and were going to park in this parking lot, or the one next to it. It's 1 AM, so all nearby restaurants are closed. Or B. They were going to continue straight down that road and go into the residential areas to go home. They did neither of these things, and instead turned right back towards the main downtown area, which heavily suggested that they were heading back to loop around the block again, because they potentially saw us in the parking lot, but it was too late and had missed the turn. After that, we were on high alert. We abandoned our bar plans and immediately hightailed it out of there while they were heading around the block. We took routes that were not the main or the most obvious ones, but still in populated areas, so we had as much of a chance of losing them as possible. Thankfully, we never saw them again after that point. For the entire duration of all of this, my first thought was that it was an undercover cop trying to catch us with a DUI, because I was buzzed and paranoid. Maybe they saw us leave the bar and get into our car and decided to follow us. Afterwards though, as my friend and I were talking about it, that seems unlikely. Why would they follow us for nearly 6 blocks and never attempt to pull us over? Wouldn't they flip on their lights once we started driving, or whenever the other cars were getting between us and the intersection? It just feels more sinister than that. I'm extremely thankful that we noticed them immediately, and we never got out the car at that second bar to allow them to catch us up. So creepy strangers, let's not meet again. I moved out on my own for the first time, about 2 hours away from my parents in order to go to college. The year in question is 2012. Within the first few weeks of being there, a random guy stopped me on campus and asked me out. I am a very shy, very introverted person. This had never happened to me before. I said yes. We exchanged numbers and went our separate ways. At the time, I didn't have a cell phone. I only had a Skype number, so I made sure to explain that to him. However, he would still call me all day while I was at school, and I had no access to my Skype number while I was there, which I told him, and it honestly kind of put me off. Several days later, I needed to run errands, so I walked to Walmart a good 2 miles from my apartment, bought what I needed, and began walking back. It started to rain, and I thought, wow, it's just gonna be one of those days, huh? About a mile into my walk home, a car slowed down beside me. It was him. He asked me if I wanted a ride. I was naive, sore, and tired, and I got into the car without even thinking of the possible consequences. He made a big to-do about how he wasn't from that part of town, and how lucky I was he ran into me while he happened to be doing errands there. He drove me to my place and asked if I wanted to go to lunch and a movie with him after I put my stuff up. I said sure, why not? He did seem really friendly. Once I got back in the car, things started to get weird. He asked me if I liked seafood. I said no, I really dislike it. He said, well, that doesn't matter. I'm taking you to a really nice seafood place. I'm sure they'll have something you can manage to like. For me, this was my first red flag. Why would you completely dismiss what I'm saying? That means my opinion doesn't matter? However, I come from a very narcissistic home, so I thought that perhaps I was reading too much into it. He started asking me about my major, my friends, my hobby, all the normal stuff. Once we get to the restaurant and sat down, he gave me the weirdest look and started asking if anything I had said was true. What? Are these people you're talking about real? Do they actually exist? Yeah, they're real people in my class. I don't believe you. These people don't sound real. I don't know what not to believe. It weirded me out to be outright accused of making up my friends like that. He went on to accuse me of lying about every detail about my life. Still, little old southern polite me kept a straight face and got through lunch, but it certainly was bizarre. We went to the movie, and he kept trying to touch me the entire time. I was already so put off from the earlier things that I didn't reciprocate. He got aggravated by this and brought it up once that we were out in the car, about how he expected me to be more friendly. No. He takes me home, and I was glad to have that date behind me. I thought it was over. I refused to return his calls and I avoided him at school. Everything is done, right? Of course not. He started showing up to my apartment daily, 8:30 on the dot, to bang on my front door for 30 minutes straight. He wouldn't even take a single minute break. If I answered, he would ask if I wanted to go to lunch later in the day with him. I always told him that I was busy. If I didn't answer, he would just continue the knocking. I didn't have a car, and I walked everywhere, and I started noticing him driving past me several times when I'd walk places. He kept offering me rides, to which I'd say no, thank you, and he also kept calling me daily. This went on for about 2 months. All in all, I'd say I'm lucky it never escalated beyond this, and that it stopped after the 2 months. However, it was scary as hell at the time. My roommate in college and I were watching a documentary about exorcisms in our living room one night. She was a neuroscience major, and she was explaining to me different scientific theories and explanations for what exorcisms could really be, other than paranormal possessions. Then, in the middle of her talking, a glass wine bottle that I placed on top of our fridge in the very back flew off the top of the refrigerator and slammed on the floor. It didn't break somehow. We got really spooked for a second, but then just let it go and kept watching the documentary and talking about how we really didn't believe in demons and whatnot. Then, our overhead fan with 3 individual light bulbs that weren't on a circuit, meaning they go out individually when each light bulb dies and not at the same time, all went out at the same time. We checked. They had all blown out for some reason. We were really freaked out after that, and left the apartment for the night. It may have just been weird coincidences, but pretty freaky nonetheless. How can a glass wine bottle just fly over a fridge and hit the floor. I still don't know how to explain that one away. In 2010, I was a second-year student nurse, studying in a university. My two friends and I decided to have some McDonald's after class. Around 8 p.m. before we split up, one of my friends said that she needed to pee. So we went to the nearest building outside the university extension of a hospital because it was getting late and we wanted to go home as soon as possible. It was the laboratory building where all the medical students had their classes, with all the taxidermies, real bones on display, chemicals and creepy stuff for normal people. And oh, the morgue with freshly delivered corpses were there too. A guard was standing at the entrance, and since we were in our uniforms and had IDs, he just let us in. As we were walking through the long hallway, with elegant paintings on either side of the walls, one of my friends started to sing. Well, because she loved to, and maybe because it was eerie quiet and it echoed. We were fooling around and laughing and talking nonsense at the top of our lungs. Maybe we mutually found it satisfying to hear our voices echoed, and because we knew that there were no more classes at this time, we were sure we weren't disturbing anybody. At the end of the hallway, there was this long, marbled, curved grand staircase leading to a dim-lighted second floor. It was all fun, and that's when we reached the second floor, and we were all flabbergasted. I know we were not scared, but just really puzzled. There was this girl wearing a lab gown, standing, inches away from the wall, slightly bowed down. She was facing between the corner of this giant post and a wall. At first I thought she was just using her phone, but then I noticed both of her arms were hanging freely, either at her side. Her waist-long black hair draping both sides of her face was curly and dripping wet. We didn't do anything, we just slowly passed her. We calculated our steps to make no noise as we did so, and I don't know if my friends were looking at her as we were walking sideways slowly, but I did. I intently gazed at her, but she didn't react, did not even move or glance at us, but just stood there. When we reached the restroom, none of us talked about it. We were not even talking about anything. I don't know what they were thinking about, but it was just strange. After we'd done our business, we passed by the same route, and she wasn't there anymore. Then I noticed she was standing a few feet away from the morgue earlier. The first door after reaching the top of the staircase was the morgue. Unclaimed bodies of prisoners with the corpses donated there. Until now, my two friends never talked about that incident. I don't know if they totally forgot, or chose to forget. This story is one of my brief friendship with a guy that didn't stop following me, and I'm sharing it for closure. I started my freshman year of college at a university in a hometown that's pretty nice. I'm not going to share too much about it, but it has a smaller amount of students, but enough so that you wouldn't run into people often. I lived on campus, and was only 17 at the time. I had Tinder, of course, as I was fresh out of a relationship and looking to experience new things in college. I matched with this one boy, Asher, who seemed nice enough. Pretty socially awkward, but I never really minded, because I have anxiety issues myself, and I'm really sympathetic to it. Because of that, I ignored a lot of warning signs I shouldn't have. We texted for a while, and he seemed really nice and caring. He wanted to know a lot about me, which I wasn't too keen on sharing, but I told him the basics and we texted regularly. He lived on campus as well, and invited me to hang out. At that time, things didn't seem too sketchy, so I was completely down. When I first met him, that's when things began to get uncomfortable. We hung out in his dorm, which was pretty standard overall. I got cozy with him on his couch, and I'd say almost cuddling, but not quite. Still really standard. When we started talking more, I realized how uncomfortable things really were. He kept making comments that just put me off, but I tried to ignore them. Things like, "I've never cuddled with anyone before. Sorry if I'm doing it wrong." And so many comments about how he already liked me a lot and wanted me to stay forever. Weird word choice, but whatever. He's just trying to be nice. I'll let him down easy. I ended that hanging out pretty quickly for some fake excuse and went right back to my room. He kept texting me and professing how much he was into me, and I told him, "Sorry, but I'm not looking for any kind of relationship, so I do not want to keep things romantic." A bad lie, but I'm a very non-confrontational person and did not want to be mean. That's when things started to get really weird. He sent me this long paragraph saying about how it was okay if I didn't want a relationship now, and that he'd wait for me and save his virginity for me. We had never talked about anything like that. I'd never even really told him that I liked him or flirted back. I just never turned him down. It was one of the creepiest messages I've ever received. Unfortunately, that was just the start of all the weird things to come. He wouldn't leave me alone even though I kept trying to de-escalate things, and I kept running into him all over campus. I wasn't sure how he suddenly was nearby when my classes ended, and I wasn't sure why we'd both be in the dining hall at the same time, even though I hadn't changed my regular routine, but I just tried to brush it off, which was definitely a mistake. I ended up turning him down completely because I was getting creeped out and couldn't figure out how he wasn't understanding that I didn't want anything romantic with him at all. He started guilt-tripping me, telling me how he was going to end himself and that no one was ever going to love him. I had been in manipulative relationships in the past, and I recognized that behavior right off the bat and shut it down. I told him I couldn't be friends with him, and in my head, that was that. He didn't reply for a while, but when he did, all hell broke loose. I was luckily out of town at the time for a concert, so that made me feel a lot better. He went off, sent me paragraph after paragraph about how horrible of a person I was and how I needed to get put into my place. I can handle that. I just ignored it. Then, once the regret set in, he made it his mission to win my love however possible. He apologized profusely, told me how he couldn't be with me all alone, and how I was his only friend and how much he loved me. Whatever. Terrible, but I didn't care about that. Then I guess to prove his dedication, he did the creepiest thing yet. First, he told me that he was outside my room, and we did not live in the same dorm building, so I don't know who let him in. I wasn't there, my roommate was out, so that was okay. And you can't actually get in the buildings unless you live there. I messaged him back at that point and told him to leave, and how wrong and creepy that was, and he pulled out his last resort. He just sent me screenshots of my contacts in his phone. On Apple devices, you can fill in tons of information and have a notes section. Everything was entirely full. He knew my home address, my room number on campus, my parents' and brothers' names, my pets' names, and my schedule. It was terrifying because I'm a fairly private person. My Instagram is my only social media, and I do not share that much on it. I don't think I'll ever find out how he discovered all of that about me. I blocked him on everything right away and reported him to the school. The school, of course, did nothing at all. I still see him on campus, and he still tries to approach me when I see him. I always duck and run, and it's worked so far. To the terrifying Tinder match, who may still be following me around, let's not meet. This happened in college. My sophomore year, I was living in the dorms and was assigned a random roommate. He seemed a little bit introverted but fairly normal at first. But he wouldn't really talk to me. I would try to start conversations about things he showed interest in, but he would only give me one-word answers that were obviously meant to end the conversation. I figured he probably just didn't like me, so I decided to give him some space and leave him alone. After a few days it started. I would notice that he would always be looking in my direction. I chalked it up to coincidence, but it kept happening. Classes started up, and I spent less and less time in the room, but whatever. I was there and he would be constantly looking in my direction. When I would turn to face him, he would turn his head away, but it would creep me out since it was pretty much constant. I started noticing he would lay on his bed to read, and would hold the book or papers at angles that always gave him a direct line of sight to me. About a week or so into the semester, my girlfriend at the time and I went on a morning hike and crashed on my bed at around 2 p.m. We woke up to him just standing there, staring at us about 2 hours later. He didn't say anything, just turned and left the room. At that point, I decided I needed to leave before he ended me in my sleep and ate my face, and I was out of there pretty quickly. I even told him within the first few days to please stop staring at me, and he outright denied doing it. Fortunately though, I didn't see him again for quite a while, but we ended up having a class together senior year. I'd been telling my friends the story ever since it happened, and they didn't believe me. One of my friends had really poor vision, so we sat in the front row. Of course, every time I looked behind me, my old roommate would be staring directly at me. Not at the teacher, but at me. It didn't matter if we were in the middle or one of the sides. I challenged them to look back a single time during the semester and catch him not looking with me. Within 5 classes they gave up and agreed that he was staring at me non-stop, and he was super creepy. My parents think he was in love with me, but I think his motives were far more sinister. Last year, I was working a shift as a library tutor. My job is to workshop people's essays and help them improve their writing. It's normally pretty rewarding, and you get to know interesting people. Until I met this guy. The most uncomfortable I've ever been was some dude hitting on me, or this really religious girl trying to convert me during our session. I can deal with that stuff. This dude was next level creepy. I don't believe in psychic impressions, so when I say this dude gave off bad vibes, what I mean is his minute body language must have been sending off my subconscious mind a lot of massive red flags straight off the bat. Maybe he did just emit evil psychic mojo. In any case, as soon as he sat down, I was uneasy about his presence immediately. He looked totally normal, kind of handsome, very average, and he had this dead-eyed look that made way too much eye contact. He sat in an off-kilter position, with one side facing away from me, his head not looking directly towards me. I tried to be super friendly and accommodating, thinking maybe he just seemed off to me, because he was autistic or perhaps had Asperger's, since I did have a lot of autistic friends who also struggled with body language and eye contact. The whole time we spoke, he had this weird little side smile, like he was amused by something I didn't know about. I read through his essay, and the uneasiness in the pit of my stomach grew. It was total nonsense. Absolute psychotic nonsense. It was like reading Time Cube. The grammar was terrible, spelling was bad, opinions would be inserted at inappropriate moments, and the logic was super tangential and inconsistent. Still trying to be helpful, I asked him to go through sentence by sentence with me and talk through his ideas. We went through and painstakingly changed each sentence to attempt to thread some semblance of logic throughout the thing. It was only by, like, the third paragraph of this mess, reading it the second time through, that I finally figured out what this essay was about. It was a book report on a piece of pro-Nazi fiction. He'd been given a "write about any book you want" assignment, and the text he chose was this pro-Nazi book about this heroic Nazi soldier being oppressed after the war for his ideals and actions. It was absolutely Nazi propaganda, and this dude was high-key praising it for 3 nonsensical pages. I was now feeling extremely uneasy. I fall into quite a few demographics that the Nazis wanted to eradicate, and this dude had been making me feel unsafe and uncomfortable without even doing anything so far. So I was walking on eggshells for the rest of the session. I helped him edit his essay and polish his little thesis. I think if I had any foresight, I'd have intentionally sabotaged his paper on principle, but in that moment, I was way too skeeved out to think a plan through like that, and I just wanted him to leave. When he did finally leave, I noticed his backpack had a lot of patches with guns and other military imagery. That also creeped me out. I have friends who love big guns, and they're super chill, but in this context it unsettled me even more. There had been something about his voice, the way he spoke, and his word choice that made me feel uneasy as well. He spoke a little slowly, without much emotion, and had a slight lift to his speech that I recognized but couldn't place. I thought I'd heard his voice before, but I didn't know where. The next day, I realized that his speech patterns had sounded so familiar, because I listened to the Sword and Scale podcast, which frequently has interrogation tapes, court tapes, and interviews with murderers. I like to research serial killers and true crime as a hobby, and this dude had the same speech patterns, cadence, and other emotionless delivery as the convicted serial killers' recordings. I hadn't even realized that serial killers had commonalities in their speech patterns until that moment. This dude spoke like one who'd been in an interrogation room. Maybe I was overreacting, but I do believe that our brains are good at picking up on red flags, and this guy set off all my alarms. I've never had such a strong, irrational gut reaction to someone I've only just met. And never again have I had it. When he walked away, I remember thinking, I hope he doesn't shoot up the campus. He gave off the distinct impression of someone who would do something like that. I had to go take a bath when I got home to feel like I was clean. That's how skeevy this guy was. I forgot about him until today, because I've been watching videos about Elliot Rogers and Andrew Blaze, and both of them reminded me of this guy a lot. I hope he dropped out and never came back. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I have a bit of a college horror story myself. At university, I shared a room with a really terrible guy. I think I'll probably talk about it on another occasion. There's so much to add. I should probably write it down. He was the worst. He never did anything outright creepy to me, but he was just an absolute nightmare to live with. If you enjoyed today's video, please let me know. Likes are always nice if you want to do that. And thank you to all my lovely patrons who can be seen on screen. Your support is extremely valued and really helps running the channel. If you're interested in becoming a patron, receiving some awesome perks, and having your name displayed at the end of every video, you can find the information at the top of the description where it says Patreon. Yeah, it would really mean a lot if you check it out, but of course, it's fine either way. You can do whatever you want. So yeah, I hope that you guys enjoyed tonight's video. But with that being said, it's time for me to sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.